There comes a moment in every adult life when the weight of accumulated things, obligations, and expectations becomes almost unbearable. Perhaps you felt it too, that quiet desperation that Henry David Thoreau wrote about over a century and a half ago, when he observed that most people lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. It's a feeling that seems to intensify as we move through our 30s and beyond, when the promises of our 20s begin to reveal themselves as mirages, and we start to question whether the path we've been walking is truly our own, or simply one that was laid out for us by a society that values acquisition over experience, busyness over being, complexity over clarity. Thoreau understood something profound about human nature that we're only now beginning to rediscover in our modern age of overwhelming choice and constant stimulation. He recognized that freedom isn't found in having more options, but in having fewer, better ones. It isn't discovered through accumulation, but through subtraction. It doesn't come from adding complexity to our lives, but from removing everything that doesn't serve our deepest purpose. When he retreated to Walden Pond in 1845, he wasn't running away from life, he was running toward it, stripping away the non-essential to discover what was truly essential, creating space for what mattered most by eliminating what mattered least. The 30s mark a curious threshold in human experience. By this age, most of us have accumulated enough stuff to fill multiple homes, enough commitments to fill multiple calendars, enough digital connections to span the globe, and enough information to overwhelm any previous generation of humans. We've been told that these accumulations represent success, progress, achievement, yet something feels fundamentally wrong. The more we have, the less satisfied we seem to feel. The more connected we become, the more isolated we experience ourselves. The more informed we are, the more confused we become about what actually matters. This isn't an accident or a personal failing. It's the natural result of living in a culture that has confused means with ends, that has mistaken the tools for the goal, that has forgotten the difference between a good life and a full life. Thoreau saw this confusion clearly in his own time, when industrialization was beginning to transform American society, and his insights ring even more true today, when that transformation has reached levels he could never have imagined. He wrote that a man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let alone, and this wisdom becomes more relevant with each passing year as our lives become more cluttered with things we can't afford to let alone. The process of simplification isn't about deprivation or asceticism for its own sake. It's about clarity. It's about removing the static so you can hear the signal. It's about clearing away the debris so you can see the foundation. When Thoreau built his small cabin at Walden Pond, he wasn't trying to prove that everyone should live in the woods. He was demonstrating that most of what we think we need is actually getting in the way of what we truly need. His experiment was about discovering the irreducible minimum, the essential core around which a meaningful life could be constructed. Consider how much energy you spend each day managing things that don't actually contribute to your well-being or growth. Consider how much time you dedicate to maintaining possessions that possess you more than you possess them. Consider how much mental bandwidth is consumed by commitments that drain rather than energize you, by relationships that diminish rather than enhance you, by activities that distract rather than focus you. This isn't about judging these things as inherently bad, but about questioning whether they serve the life you actually want to live or merely the life you think you're supposed to want to live. Thoreau's great insight was that most of our problems stem not from having too little, but from having too much of the wrong things and too little of the right things. We have too much stuff and too little space, too much noise and too little silence, too many acquaintances and too few deep friendships, too much information and too little wisdom. Too many options and too little clarity about what we actually want. Too much busyness and too little purpose. The solution isn't to add more of anything, but to subtract everything that doesn't align with our deepest values and truest self. This process of subtraction requires tremendous courage because it means saying no to things that others value, things that society tells us we should want, things that our younger selves might have dreamed of acquiring. It means disappointing people who have different priorities. It means facing the fear that we might be making a mistake, that we might regret letting go of opportunities or possessions or connections that we worked hard to obtain. But this fear, Thoreau would argue, is precisely what keeps us trapped in lives that feel more like elaborate prisons than expressions of freedom. The freedom that comes from simplification isn't the freedom to do whatever we want whenever we want, which is actually a form of chaos and ultimately feels empty. It's the freedom to align our actions with our values, to spend our time and energy on what truly matters to us, to live with intention rather than merely reacting to whatever demands the loudest attention. It's the freedom that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for, from having the space and clarity to hear your own voice above the noise of cultural expectations and social pressures. When you begin to simplify your life, something remarkable happens. The things that remain become more vivid, more meaningful, more satisfying. A smaller wardrobe means each piece of clothing is chosen with care and worn with pleasure. Fewer possessions means each one can be truly appreciated, rather than merely stored. Fewer commitments means the ones you keep can receive your full attention and energy. Fewer acquaintances means your friendships can deepen into something more substantial and nourishing. Fewer activities means the ones you choose can become sources of genuine fulfillment rather than mere ways to pass time. This isn't about living in poverty or denying yourself pleasure. Thoreau himself was clear about this. He wrote about the simple pleasures he found at Walden Pond, the beauty of the changing seasons, the satisfaction of growing his own food, the peace that came from having time to think and observe and write. He found richness in simplicity, abundance, in having enough rather than having everything, luxury in the space to breathe and think and be. His life at Walden wasn't sparse, it was concentrated, like a rich sauce that has been reduced to its essence, more flavorful precisely because everything unnecessary has been removed. The modern world makes this kind of concentration difficult because it profits from our distraction. Every industry has an interest in convincing us that we need more of what they're selling, whether that's products or services or experiences, or information or entertainment or connections. The entire economic system depends on our dissatisfaction, on our belief that happiness lies in the next purchase, the next upgrade, the next experience, the next connection. Simplification threatens this system because it suggests that we might already have enough, that we might find satisfaction in what we already possess, that we might discover fulfillment in less rather than more. This is why the choice to simplify often feels radical, even subversive. It challenges not just our personal habits, but the fundamental assumptions of the culture we live in. It suggests that the emperor has no clothes, that the pursuit of more for its own sake is ultimately hollow, that the good life might be found in a completely different direction than the one our society is heading. It takes courage to swim against this current, to choose less when everyone around you is choosing more, to prioritize being over having, to value depth over breadth, to seek meaning over excitement. But this courage is rewarded in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced them. There's a lightness that comes from owning fewer things, a freedom that comes from having fewer obligations, a clarity that comes from having fewer distractions. There's also a kind of confidence that develops when you discover that you can be happy with less, when you realize that your well-being doesn't depend on external circumstances as much as you thought it did. when you find that contentment is something you can cultivate rather than something you have to chase. Thoreau spent 2 years at Walden Pond, and when he left, he wrote that he did so because he had other lives to live and couldn't spare any more time for that one. This is perhaps the most important aspect of his experiment, that it was temporary, that it was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. He used his time of radical simplification to discover what was essential, and then he carried those insights back into a more conventional life, but a life that was now informed by the clarity he had gained through subtraction. You don't need to move to the woods to benefit from Thoreau's insights. You can begin the process of simplification wherever you are, with whatever you have, by questioning what you truly need versus what you think you need, by examining which of your possessions and commitments and activities actually contribute to your well-being and which merely consume your time and energy without giving anything meaningful in return. You can start small with a single drawer or a single commitment or a single habit and gradually expand the process as you begin to experience the benefits of having less but better, fewer but deeper, simpler but richer. The goal isn't to live like Thoreau or to replicate his specific choices, but to apply his principles to your own life, to discover your own version of essential living, to find your own balance between having enough and having too much, to create your own space for what matters most by eliminating what matters least. This is deeply personal work because what's essential for one person might be superfluous for another. What brings one person joy might bring another person stress. What feels like freedom to one person might feel like limitation to another. The key is learning to listen to your own inner voice rather than the voices of advertisers and influencers and well-meaning friends and family members who have their own ideas about what your life should look like. The key is developing the courage to disappoint others in service of being true to yourself. The key is remembering that you have only one life to live, and that life is happening right now, not in some imaginary future when you've finally acquired enough stuff, or achieved enough success, or impressed enough people to feel worthy of happiness. Thoreau wrote that the price of anything is the amount of life you have to give up for it. This is perhaps the most practical way to think about simplification, not as deprivation, but as good investment strategy, as a way of ensuring that you're spending your most precious resource, your time and energy and attention, on things that actually provide a return in terms of satisfaction and meaning and growth. When you look at your possessions and commitments and activities through this lens, it becomes much easier to see what's worth keeping and what's worth letting go. The process of letting go can be surprisingly emotional. We become attached not just to things themselves, but to the stories we tell ourselves about those things, to the identities we've constructed around our possessions and achievements and relationships. Letting go of stuff can feel like letting go of parts of ourselves, like erasing chapters from our personal history, like admitting that we were wrong about what we needed or wanted or valued. This is natural and normal, and it's also temporary. The grief that comes with letting go is often followed by relief, by a sense of lightness and freedom that makes the temporary discomfort worthwhile. There's also practical resistance to simplification because our culture has made it genuinely difficult to live simply. We're often required to own certain things or maintain certain commitments or participate in certain activities just to function. In society, we need cars to get to work, homes to live in, clothes to wear, technology to communicate. We have families and jobs and legal obligations that can't simply be abandoned. The art of simplification lies in distinguishing between what's truly necessary and what's merely conventional, between what serves your actual needs and what serves other people's expectations or your own unconscious assumptions about what a successful life should look like. This distinction requires ongoing attention and adjustment because the line between necessary and unnecessary isn't fixed. What you need changes as your circumstances change, as your values evolve, as your priorities shift. What felt essential at 25 might feel burdensome at 35. What seemed important when you were trying to establish yourself in your career might seem less relevant when you're more secure and established. What made sense when you were single might need to be reconsidered now that you're in a relationship or have children. Simplification isn't a one-time project, but an ongoing practice, a way of regularly examining your life and making adjustments to ensure that your external circumstances continue to align with your internal priorities. The benefits of this ongoing practice extend far beyond having a cleaner house or a less cluttered calendar. When you regularly practice letting go of what doesn't serve you, you develop the skill of non-attachment, which is one of the foundations of emotional resilience and mental peace. You become less dependent on external circumstances for your sense of well-being. You become more adaptable when circumstances change because you're not as invested in maintaining specific conditions or possessions or relationships exactly as they are. You become more present because you're not constantly thinking about maintaining or improving or protecting all the things you own or all the commitments you've made. This presence is perhaps the greatest gift of simplification. When you're not constantly managing excess, you have more attention available for what's actually happening right now. You can listen more deeply in conversations because you're not mentally reviewing your to-do list. You can enjoy experiences more fully because you're not comparing them to other experiences you think you should be having. You can appreciate what you have because you're not constantly thinking about what you don't have. You can rest more completely because you're not surrounded by reminders of tasks that need to be done. Thoreau understood that most of our suffering comes not from lacking things we need, but from being overwhelmed by things we don't need. He saw that the cure for this suffering wasn't to acquire more things, but to need fewer things, not to fulfill more desires, but to examine which desires actually serve our deepest well-being, and which merely distract us from discovering what that well-being actually consists of. His experiment at Walden Pond was an attempt to strip away everything non-essential so he could discover what was essential, to reduce his life to its basic elements so he could understand what those elements were and how they related to each other. What he discovered was that very little is actually necessary for a rich and meaningful life. He needed shelter, but not a mansion. He needed food, but not delicacies. He needed clothing, but not fashion. He needed companionship, but not constant social stimulation. He needed mental engagement, but not endless entertainment. He needed purpose, but not fame or status or wealth. He found that when he provided for these basic needs simply and directly, without elaboration or excess, he had abundant time and energy for what truly mattered to him: thinking, writing, observing nature, developing his understanding of himself and the world around him. This doesn't mean that everyone should live exactly as Thoreau lived, but it does suggest that everyone could benefit from conducting their own experiment in essential living, from discovering their own version of enough, from finding their own balance between simplicity and richness, between having what they need and being overwhelmed by what they don't need. This experiment doesn't require moving to the woods or giving up all your possessions or abandoning all your commitments. It simply requires the willingness to question what you actually need versus what you think you need, to examine which aspects of your current life actually contribute to your well-being and which merely consume your resources without providing meaningful returns. The results of this examination might surprise you. You might discover that you feel more satisfied after decluttering your home than after buying something new. You might find that saying no to social obligations you don't enjoy gives you more energy for the relationships you truly value. You might realize that having fewer clothes makes getting dressed easier and more enjoyable rather than more difficult. You might learn that owning fewer books means you actually read and reread the ones you keep, instead of letting them gather dust on shelves. You might find that preparing simple meals at home is more nourishing than eating elaborate meals at restaurants. These discoveries don't happen automatically. They require attention and intention, and often some initial discomfort as you adjust to new ways of living and being. They also require patience, because the benefits of simplification often take time to manifest. It's easy to notice immediately what you've given up, but it takes longer to notice what you've gained. The space to breathe, the time to think, the energy to focus on what matters most, the clarity that comes from reduced distraction, the peace that comes from reduced overwhelm. The path towards simplification is deeply personal, because what constitutes a simple life varies dramatically from person to person, depending on their circumstances, values, responsibilities, and goals. A simple life for someone with young children will look different from a simple life for someone who is single. A simple life for someone who works from home will look different from a simple life for someone who travels frequently for work. A simple life for someone who is introverted will look different from a simple life for someone who is extroverted. The key is not to copy someone else's version of simplicity, but to discover your own, to find what works for your specific situation and temperament and aspirations. This discovery process requires both honesty and courage. Honesty to admit which aspects of your current life actually serve you and which merely serve your image or other people's expectations or unconscious habits you've never questioned. Courage to make changes that others might not understand, to disappoint people who benefit from your current commitments, to face the uncertainty that comes with letting go of familiar patterns, even when those patterns aren't serving you well. The courage required for simplification is not the dramatic courage of heroic action, but the quiet courage of everyday choices. The courage to say no when others expect you to say yes. The courage to choose quality over quantity. The courage to prioritize your own well-being over other people's approval. The courage to trust that less might actually be more, that subtraction might actually be addition, that letting go might actually be a form of holding on to what matters most. Thoreau's legacy isn't found in the specific details of his life at Walden Pond, but in the principle he demonstrated: that it's possible to live deliberately, to make conscious choices about how to spend your time and energy and attention, to create a life that expresses your deepest values rather than merely responding to external pressures and expectations. His example suggests that freedom isn't something that happens to you, but something you create through the choices you make, the boundaries you set, the priorities you establish, the things you choose to keep, and the things you choose to let go. This freedom becomes increasingly important as we age, because we become increasingly aware of the finite nature of our time and energy. In our 20s, it's easy to believe that we have unlimited resources, that we can pursue every opportunity and maintain every relationship and acquire every experience that appeals to us. By our 30s and beyond, we begin to understand that every yes is also a no, that every choice to include something in our lives is also a choice to exclude other things, that our resources are limited and therefore must be invested wisely rather than scattered randomly. This understanding can be initially depressing because it forces us to confront our limitations and mortality. But it can also be liberating because it clarifies our choices and focuses our attention on what truly matters. When you realize that you can't do everything, you become more thoughtful about what you choose to do. When you realize that you can't have everything, you become more appreciative of what you choose to have. When you realize that you can't please everyone, You become more intentional about whom you choose to please and how you choose to please them. The practice of simplification is ultimately about learning to live within your means, not just financially, but temporally and emotionally and energetically. It's about right-sizing your life so that it fits your actual capacity rather than your imagined capacity, so that it reflects your authentic priorities rather than your borrowed priorities, so that it expresses your true self rather than your idealized self. This right-sizing often requires letting go of dreams and plans and identities that no longer serve you, which can be painful but is also profoundly freeing. When Thoreau wrote about living deliberately, he was advocating for this kind of conscious right-sizing, this intentional alignment between your inner life and your outer life, between what you value and how you live, between what you need and what you have. He understood that most people sleepwalk through their lives, making choices based on habit or social pressure or unconscious assumptions rather than conscious reflection and deliberate decision-making. His experiment at Walden Pond was an attempt to wake up from this sleepwalking, to live with full awareness and intentionality, to make every choice a conscious choice rather than an automatic one. This way of living requires ongoing attention because it's easy to slip back into unconscious patterns, to accumulate things and commitments and obligations without noticing, to let the complexity creep back in gradually until you find yourself once again overwhelmed and distracted and disconnected from what matters most. The solution isn't to achieve perfect simplicity once and then maintain it forever, but to develop the habit of regular examination and adjustment, to periodically take inventory of your life and make conscious choices about what to keep and what to let go, what to add and what to subtract, what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. This ongoing practice of conscious living is perhaps Thoreau's greatest gift to us, not the specific techniques he used, but the general principle he demonstrated, that it's possible to live with intention rather than merely reacting to circumstances, to make deliberate choices rather than falling into unconscious patterns, to create a life that expresses your deepest values rather than merely conforming to external expectations. His example reminds us that we have more choice than we often realize, that we can shape our lives rather than merely enduring them, that we can find freedom through simplification rather than accumulation, peace through subtraction rather than addition, richness through focus rather than dispersion. The journey towards simplification is not always easy, but it is always worthwhile because it leads toward greater alignment between who you are and how you live, between what you value and what you do, between what you need and what you have. It leads toward the kind of freedom that can't be taken away by external circumstances because it comes from within, from knowing yourself deeply enough to make choices that serve your authentic well-being rather than your imagined well-being, from having the courage to live according to your own values rather than other people's expectations, from discovering that enough is enough and that enough can be extraordinarily rich when it's consciously chosen rather than unconsciously accumulated. This is the real freedom that Thoreau discovered at Walden Pond, and that he spent the rest of his life trying to articulate and share. It's a freedom that's available to anyone willing to undertake the work of simplification, anyone courageous enough to question what they actually need, anyone committed enough to align their outer life with their inner values. It's a freedom that becomes more precious and more necessary as we age and as we become more aware of the finite nature of our time and energy and attention. It's a freedom that can transform not just how we live, but who we are, not just what we have, but what we appreciate, not just what we do, but why we do it. The invitation is always there, in every moment, to choose simplicity over complexity, clarity over confusion, depth over breadth, quality over quantity, being over having, conscious living over unconscious reaction. The invitation is to discover what Thoreau discovered, That a simple life is not a lesser life, but a concentrated life, not a deprived life, but a focused life, not a limited life, but a deliberate life. The invitation is to find your own version of Walden Pond, your own space for essential living, your own balance between enough and too much, your own path toward the freedom that comes not from having everything, but from needing less, not from doing everything, but from doing what matters, not from being everything to everyone, but from being true to yourself.